Welcome back to Unshakable Belief. I'm Monica Azoulay, and this is the podcast where we investigate the stories that shape us. Most personal development asks, who do you want to become? But I believe there's a question that has to come first. Who have you become and why? Because behavior isn't random, behavior is evidence. Behavior leaves clues. Every reaction, every habit, every fear, and every pattern tells a story. And when we become curious enough to understand that story, we create the freedom to choose what comes next. Today, we're going to continue our investigation into control. And I want to start with a question. When did letting go stop feeling safe? Not when did you become controlling, not when did you become too much, not when did you become someone who needs everything your way, because honestly, I don't think most of us identify with those words anyway. If someone says you're controlling, most of us immediately feel ourselves push back. We get defensive because the word feels like an accusation, like a character flaw. It feels like someone is saying we don't trust people or that we think we know better than everyone else. But what if we've misunderstood control? What if some of the behaviors we've labeled as controlling are actually clues? What if they're evidence? Evidence of a story, evidence of an experience, evidence of a moment when our brain learned something important about the world. That's the question I want to investigate today. Because the longer I do this work, the more convinced I become that very few behaviors appear out of nowhere. Our patterns have history. Our reactions have roots. The things we judge ourselves for today often began as things that helped us navigate yesterday. And control is one of those behaviors. Because sometimes control isn't about wanting power. Sometimes control is about wanting safety. Sometimes control isn't about believing nobody else can do something. Sometimes it's about remembering all the times when nobody did. Sometimes control isn't really saying, I need everything my way. Sometimes it's quietly saying, I need to know that I'm going to be okay. And that changes the entire conversation. Because when we stop judging the behavior, we can finally investigate the story. For most of my life, I would never have described myself as controlling. I would have said I was responsible, prepared, organized, dependable, the person who could figure things out, the person who could handle things, the person people could count on. Here's the tricky part. Those things, they were all true. That's why this work gets complicated. Because the behaviors that eventually exhaust us are often the same behaviors that were celebrated for years. People praise the person who holds everything together. They praise the person who always has a plan. They praise the person who anticipates every possible problem. They praise the person who never drops the ball. And slowly, without realizing it, we start believing this is who I am. But one of the most important questions I've learned to ask myself is this who I am? Or is this who I had to become? Because those are two very different things. And that question has changed everything. When I started investigating my own patterns, I realized there were so many things I called personality traits that were actually survival strategies. I wasn't born believing I needed to think 10 steps ahead. I learned that. I wasn't born believing I needed to prepare for every possible outcome. I learned that. I wasn't born believing that relaxing was difficult or that letting go felt uncomfortable. Somewhere along the way, my brain connected being prepared with being safe. And honestly, it made sense. That's the part we miss when we're trying so hard to change ourselves. We skip over the compassion. We go straight to, why am I like this? What's wrong with me? Why can't I just relax? why can't I let things happen? But reset asks a different question. What happened that made this behavior make sense? Because once you find the story, the behavior usually stops looking so random. When I started looking at my own life through that lens, I started seeing the evidence everywhere. Not the evidence that something was wrong with me, evidence that my behaviors had a story. Because for a very long time, I thought my ability to handle things was just who I was. I was independent, capable, strong. I could figure things out. And those things became such a big part of my identity that I never stopped to ask whether I was choosing them or whether I was still operating from an old belief that said I had no other option. There is a difference between saying, I can handle this, and believing I have to handle this because there's no one else. Those may look identical from the outside, but internally they feel completely different. One comes from confidence, the other comes from fear. One creates freedom, the other creates exhaustion. For years, I didn't know there was a difference. I wore my ability to carry everything like a badge of honor. And honestly, I think so many of us do. We've become proud of how much we can handle. We joke about being the person who gets things done. And we tell ourselves things like, it's just easier if I do it myself. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes that sentence is a clue because the question underneath isn't whether you are capable of doing it yourself. You probably are. The deeper question is, why does letting someone else help feel uncomfortable? Why does uncertainty create anxiety? Why does resting feel irresponsible? Why does trusting someone else feel risky? That's where the investigation begins. Because when we follow those questions backward, we usually find a story. For me, one of the stories I had to investigate was my relationship with responsibility. And I want to be really clear about something. These investigations are never about blame. That's one of the biggest misunderstandings people have about healing work. They think looking backwards means we're looking for someone to blame, but blame keeps you stuck. Curiosity creates movement. The purpose of looking backward isn't to build a case against someone else, it's to understand the case file of ourselves. It's simply gathering evidence. It's asking, what did I experience? What did I learn? What conclusions did I draw? And are those conclusions still true today? Because every single one of us is walking around with beliefs we formed during moments we may not even remember, moments where our brain made a decision. This is how I stay safe. This is how I get approval. This is how I avoid disappointment. This is how I make sure everything is okay. And those decisions can follow us for decades. When I look back at my own life, I can see how control became connected with safety. There were seasons where being able to figure things out mattered. There were seasons where being prepared helped me navigate really difficult situations. There were seasons where anticipating what could go wrong allowed me to keep moving forward. My brain wasn't trying to hurt me, it was trying to help me. And that's such an important distinction because when we start investigating ourselves, it's very easy to become frustrated. We finally see the pattern and immediately think, I can't believe I've been doing this. But what if instead we asked, of course I've been doing this. Why wouldn't I? That one question changes things because suddenly you're not fighting yourself anymore. You're understanding yourself. I think one of the most healing moments we can experience is the moment when we stop seeing our past selves as versions of us who should have known better. Because she didn't know what you know now. She didn't have the tools you have now. She didn't have the awareness you have now. She was making decisions with the information resources, and capacity that she had at the time. And maybe instead of criticizing her, maybe we need to thank her because the version of you who learned to control everything, she probably carried you through some things. The version of you who learned to prepare for everything, she probably protected you. The version of you who learned to anticipate every problem, she probably helped you survive seasons you weren't sure you would get through. The question isn't whether those strategies mattered. Of course they did. The question is, do they still need to lead? Eventually, there comes a point where we have to ask another question. Not just why did this behavior begin, but what is this behavior costing me now? Because sometimes the very thing that helped us survive one season starts limiting us in the next one. And that's a hard realization because these behaviors are usually attached to parts of ourselves that we value. For someone who has always been responsible, learning to let go can feel like becoming irresponsible. For someone who has always been prepared, learning to trust can feel careless. For someone who has always anticipated every possible problem, allowing life to unfold can feel like ignoring reality. That's why change feels so uncomfortable. We aren't just changing behaviors, we're challenging identities. And that is much deeper work. If you've spent 20 or 30 years being the person who handles everything, who are you if you don't? If you've always been the dependable one, who are you when you need support? If you've always been the strong one, who are you when you admit something feels heavy? Those questions can feel terrifying because they aren't really about calendars and plans or schedules or organization. They're about identity. They're about who we believe we have permission to be. I remember realizing that so much of my control wasn't actually about the things I thought it was about. It wasn't about wanting everything perfect. It wasn't needing everything done my way. It wasn't about thinking I knew better than everyone else. A lot of it came down to one simple thing: trust. Did I trust that it would be okay if something didn't go according to plan? Did I trust myself to handle disappointment? Did I trust that I could adjust if the circumstances changed? Did I trust God even when I couldn't see the outcome? That last one was probably the hardest because it's really easy to talk about faith when everything is going according to plan. It's much harder when you're standing in the unknown. It's much harder when you don't have the answers. And it's much harder when you can't see the next step. I think that's where so many of us wrestle. We say we trust, but our behaviors sometimes tell a different story. Remember, behavior leaves clues, not clues that we failed, not clues that we're doing something wrong, clues that maybe something deeper is asking for our attention. For me, I had to start asking, where am I saying I trust God, but still trying to control every possible outcome? And that question was really uncomfortable because I didn't want to admit that there were places where my faith and my behavior didn't match. I wanted to believe that because I prayed about something, I had surrendered it. But sometimes I would pray about it, then immediately pick it back up. I would ask for guidance and then spend hours trying to figure out every possible scenario. I would say I believed there was a purpose for my life, but still exhaust myself trying to force the timeline. And slowly, I started realizing something. Surrender isn't giving up, surrender is trusting. And those are not the same thing. I think sometimes we resist letting go because we think letting go means we stop caring. But what if letting go simply means we stop carrying what was never ours to carry? What if surrender isn't losing control? What if surrender is finally believing we are safe without it? That shift doesn't happen overnight. At least it didn't for me. I wish I could say that once I understood where control came from, I instantly stopped trying to control things. But that's not how this works. Awareness is not the finish line. Awareness is the doorway. Once you see the pattern, you finally have the opportunity to choose. And choice is where freedom begins, not perfection. Choice. The goal is not to become someone who never plans. The goal is not to throw away your calendar, ignore your responsibilities, and pretend everything will magically work out. That's not healing, that's avoidance. The goal is to know the difference between I'm planning because this supports the life I'm creating, and I'm planning because uncertainty feels unsafe. Same behavior, different story. This is why the reset methodology starts with the investigation, because we can't intentionally change what we don't understand. So if we try to skip straight to the new behavior, we tell ourselves, I need to stop controlling. I need to stop overthinking. I need to stop worrying. I need to stop trying to plan everything. But if we never understand why those behaviors developed in the first place, we're asking ourselves to let go of something that part of us believes is keeping us safe. And that creates an internal battle. One part of you wants freedom, another part of you is trying to protect you. Instead of fighting that part of yourself, what if you became curious about it? What if you asked, when did I learn this? What are you afraid would happen if you stopped? What are you trying to protect me from? Because those answers matter. The goal of this work is not to eliminate parts of ourselves, it's to understand them. It's to take the parts of us that were created in survival and allow them to finally experience safety. I think this is where so much of personal development misses the mark. We focus on becoming someone new, create a new identity, build new habits, change your mindset, become the next version of yourself. And don't get me wrong, growth absolutely matters. But I think there's a step before becoming, understanding. Because if you don't understand why you became who you are, you may spend your entire life fighting pieces of yourself that were only trying to help. The responsible one, the prepared one who plans ahead, the one who notices everything, the one who thinks deeply, the one who feels everything. Those parts of you aren't bad, they have stories. And when you finally understand the story, you get to decide whether that story still gets to write your future. That's where choice enters. That's where freedom begins. I want to pause here for a moment because if this conversation is resonating with you, I want you to know this is exactly the work we explore deeper inside the reset methodology. For so long, many of us have been taught to look at our behaviors through the lens of judgment. We ask questions like, why am I like this? Why can't I just change? Why do I keep repeating the same patterns? But what if those behaviors aren't evidence that something is wrong with you? What if they're clues? Reset is built around a different kind of question, not just who do I want to become, but who have I become and why? Because before we can create lasting change, we have to understand the stories, beliefs, and experiences that shape the way we learn to move through the world. That's why I created the reset methodology. It's an invitation to investigate yourself differently, to stop fighting the parts of yourself that helped you survive and begin understanding what they were trying to protect. I'll be hosting a free masterclass where we'll begin exploring this work together. And I'll also be sharing more about the upcoming Reset Founders Group. It's an 8-week experience designed for women who are ready to go deeper into their investigation, not from judgment, from curiosity. Not because you need to become someone else, but because maybe it's time to discover who you were always created to be. You can find the details and join the waitlist through the link in the show notes. Now, let's get back to today's investigation. When we started today's conversation, I asked a question. When did letting go stop feeling safe? Maybe as you've listened, something came to mind. Maybe a season, an experience, maybe a version of yourself you haven't thought about in a long time. If that's true, I want you to approach that version of yourself differently, not with criticism, not with shame, not with frustration, but with reverence, because she survived things. She adapted. She learned. She did what she believed she needed to do. And maybe now she doesn't need judgment. Maybe she needs someone to say, I understand why you learned this. Now we get to choose something different. Because freedom isn't found by rejecting who we were. Freedom is created when we understand who we became and decide who we want to be. So this week's investigation question is, where in your life are you still protecting yourself from something that's no longer happening? Sit with that question. Be curious. Look at the evidence. Because behavior isn't random. Behavior is evidence. Behavior leaves clues. And until next time, keep investigating the stories that shape you, because you were created for more than survival. You were created to live fully, freely, and intentionally as the person God designed you to become.